We have more information at our fingertips than any king or queen in history. We can order food from across the globe, talk to someone on the other side of the planet, and access entire libraries from a glowing rectangle in our hand. But can we make a sturdy chair? Can we bake a loaf of bread without a pre-mixed packet? Can we fix a hole in our own clothes? A medieval peasant with no formal education could likely do all three and a dozen other things besides. They lived in a world made of wood, wool, iron, and stone, and they knew how to work with it. We live in a world of plastic and pixels, and we've forgotten the language of our own hands. What have we lost in this trade? What fundamental human connection to the physical world has been severed? Maybe it's time to look back, not to abandon our modern lives, but to reclaim something essential we've left behind. Number 15, can you weave a container from a weed? It starts with something growing by the side of the road. Willow, reed, ivy, honeysuckle. Things we see as weeds or simple decoration. To our ancestors, these were the raw materials for survival. Basket weaving is one of the oldest human crafts, far older than pottery or metallurgy. Archaeologists have found fragments of baskets dating back over 10,000 years from the Fayum in Upper Egypt. These weren't art projects. They were grain silos, fishing traps, baby carriers, and shopping bags. A good basket was the difference between a harvest saved and a winter starved. The technique is simple in concept. You have rigid stakes, the skeleton of the basket, and flexible weavers that you lace in and out, over and under. That's it. But within that simplicity is a world of complexity. The type of weave, the choice of material, the shape of the form, it all depends on the basket's purpose. An open weave basket made from tough reeds might be for catching eels, and a tightly woven basket of split willow, almost waterproof, would be for carrying grain or flour. The Otzi, the Iceman, the stunningly preserved man found in the Alps and dated to around 3,300 BC, carried a backpack with a wooden frame and a container made of woven grasses. He also carried containers made of birch bark. This wasn't a hobby, this was fundamental technology. Learning to weave a basket today is a strange experience. You go out and gather your materials. You learn to look at plants differently. You see the long straight shoots of dogwood and think, stakes! You see the flexible vines of wild grape and think, weavers? You have to soak them, prepare them. Your hands get calloused and scratched. It's slow, it's repetitive, and it's incredibly meditative. The rhythm of the weave over, under connects you to something ancient. You're not just making a basket, you're reenacting a process that humans have performed for millennia. You're building something useful and beautiful from nothing but plants and your own two hands. The social aspect of this craft is often overlooked. In medieval villages and in tribal communities for thousands of years before, weaving was often a communal activity. People would gather to prepare materials and weave together, sharing stories, news, and knowledge. It was a way of binding the community together, just as the weavers bound the stakes of the basket. The craft was passed down through generations, not in books, but through observation and practice. A study published in the Journal of Anthropological Archaeology suggests that the patterns and techniques of basketry can be traced through regions and time periods, acting almost like a cultural fingerprint. A particular style of rim or a unique starting knot can tell an expert where and when a basket was likely made. But we know so little. Baskets are organic, they rot. Unlike pottery shards or metal tools, they vanish back into the earth, leaving almost no trace. For every one ancient fragment we find in a dry cave or a peat bog, thousands, maybe millions, have disappeared completely. The history of this foundational human skill is mostly gone, written in water and wind. What secret weaving techniques died with the last practitioners in isolated communities? Were their baskets so finely woven they could hold water as well as a pot, but we've never found an example? How many different plants, now considered useless weeds, were once vital resources for basket makers? Could we reconstruct entire ancient economies if we only knew what kind of baskets they used to transport their goods? Number 14, can you twist a rope that will hold your weight? We think of rope as something you buy in a plastic package at a hardware store. It's synthetic, uniform, and strong. But for almost all of human history, rope was something you made. and it was one of the most important technologies ever invented. Without rope, you can't build a cathedral. You can't rig a ship. You can't hoist water from a well or tie down a load of hay. The rope is the unsung hero of civilization. It is the technology of binding, pulling, and lifting. Making rope by hand or with simple tools is an exercise in understanding physics. The principle is torsion. You take a bundle of fibers, nettle, flax, hemp, lime bast, and you twist them. Then you take another bundle and twist it the same way. Then you twist those two bundles together in the opposite direction. The opposing forces lock the fibers together, creating a cord that is exponentially stronger than the individual strands. This is the basic building block. 3 of these cords twisted together make a rope. 3 of those ropes can be twisted into a hawser or a cable. The process is called rope laying, and for centuries it was done in long, narrow buildings called rope walks. In medieval port towns, these could be 1/4 of a mile long. Workers would walk backwards, paying out fibers from a bundle wrapped around their waist, while a wheel at the other end twisted the strands together. It was hard, dusty work. The fibers got in your lungs, but the men who did it were essential. The great sailing ships of the Age of Discovery, like Columbus's Santa Maria, were held together by miles of handmade rope, from the thinnest signal lines to the massive anchor cables as thick as a man's thigh. A book from 1794, David Steele's The Elements and Practice of Rigging and Seamanship, details the hundreds of different ropes needed for a single naval vessel, each with a specific name and purpose. The skill was in knowing not just how to make the rope, but what fibers to use and how tight to twist it for its intended job. You can try this on a small scale. Take some long grass or the inner bark of a sapling. Split it into fibers, start twisting. You will feel the moment the energy builds up in the strand, the moment it wants to kink back on itself. That's when you combine it with another twisted strand. The first time you make a piece of cordage, even just a foot long, that can hold a heavy rock, it feels like magic. You have created strength out of weakness. You have imposed order on chaos. This skill connects you directly to the natural world. You learn to identify plants not by their flowers, but by the quality of their fibers. Stinging nettle, a plant we avoid, produces some of the finest and strongest fibers, rivaling linen. The inner bark, or bast, of the lime tree was prized by the Vikings for its strength and flexibility. They used it for the rigging on their longships. This knowledge, once common, is now incredibly niche. We've lost the ability to see the world as a library of materials. Yet, despite its importance, the history of rope is as ephemeral as that of baskets. We have found ancient samples, like the ropes used to build the Egyptian pyramids, preserved by the dry climate. But for the most part, rope was used, it frayed, and it was discarded or recycled. The quiet, constant work of the rope maker has largely vanished from the historical record. What were the trade secrets of a medieval rope walk foreman? How did they treat fibers with tar and other substances to make them last longer at sea? And which formulas worked best? Were there specific plants used for rope making that have since gone extinct or are no longer recognized for their properties? How did ancient engineers calculate the precise strength of the ropes needed to lift massive stones for castles and cathedrals? Or was it all just trial and error, with catastrophic failures we'll never know about? Number 13. Can you make light where there is none? Before the switch on the wall, there was darkness. A profound, deep, and often frightening darkness that we can barely imagine today. For most people, the setting of the sun meant the end of the working day. To defy the night, you needed fire. And to make fire portable, to bring a small, controlled sun into your home, you needed a candle. The simple act of making a candle was a revolutionary act. It was the craft of creating light. There were 2 main types of candles in the medieval period, tallow and beeswax. Tallow candles were for the common folk. They were made from rendered animal fat, usually from sheep or cattle. The process was messy and smelly. You'd melt the fat down, skim off the impurities, and then repeatedly dip a wickie made from twisted cotton or rush pith into the molten tallow. Each dip would add a new layer, slowly building up the candle. Tallow candles were cheap, but they were not pleasant. They sputtered, they smoked, and they gave off a distinct, greasy odor of cooked meat. In 1462, the Worshipful Company of Tallow Chandlers was incorporated in London, a guild that regulated the quality of this essential, if unpleasant, commodity. Beeswax candles were another world entirely. They were the light of the church and the nobility. made from the wax produced by bees. They burned with a clean, bright flame, gave off very little smoke, and had a faint, sweet, honey-like scent. But they were incredibly expensive. It takes a huge amount of nectar and a huge amount of work by the bees to produce a small amount of wax. A single pound of beeswax represented the consumption of perhaps 150 pounds of honey. As such, beeswax candles were a symbol of wealth and piety. Liturgical rules in the Catholic Church often specified that candles for the altar had to be made of pure beeswax, connecting their purity and sweet smell to the divine. Making a simple tallow or beeswax candle yourself is a lesson in patience. The dipping method requires you to build the candle layer by layer. It forces you to slow down. Or you can use a mold, pouring the hot wax in and waiting for it to set. Either way, you are working with a material that changes state, from solid to liquid and back again. You learn to respect the heat. You learn how the wick is just as important as the fuel. A wick that's too thick will create a smoky flame. One that's too thin will be drowned by the melting wax. It's a delicate balance. This skill is about more than just light. It's about self-sufficiency. Imagine a power outage that lasts for days or weeks. The flashlights will run out of batteries. But if you have a source of fat or wax and know how to make a wick, you will never be in total darkness. It's a primal skill. It's the ability to push back the night on your own terms. It connects you to a fundamental human need and a tradition of craft that goes back to at least the Romans, who are credited with developing the wicked candle. The history of light is a history of progress, but also a history of loss. We have gained convenience, but we've lost our connection to the source of our light. We flick a switch and don't think about the power plant, the lines, the grid. The medieval chandler knew exactly where his light came from, the fat of a slaughtered ox or the hive of a honeybee. What other materials, besides tallow and beeswax, were used for candles that we've forgotten about? Did chandlers have secret techniques for clarifying tallow to make it burn cleaner and smell better? How did the economics of wax and tallow shape trade routes and even political alliances in the medieval world? And what was the psychological impact of living in a world where pure, clean light was a rare and expensive luxury reserved for God and the king? Number 12, can you wash your hands of the past? We take soap for granted. It's a colorful, scented bar or a liquid in a pump dispenser. We use it without a second thought, but for most of history, cleanliness was a luxury, and soap was a harsh, homemade, and precious substance. The ability to make soap was the ability to fight dirt, disease, and decay. It was a form of applied chemistry, practiced in the backyard. The basic recipe for soap has remained unchanged for thousands of years. You need two things: fat and an alkali. In the medieval period, the fat would be leftover cooking grease, butcher scraps, or tallow. The alkali was lye, which was made by a fascinatingly rustic process. You would take hardwood ashes from an oak or beech fire, for example, and place them in a wooden barrel with a drainage hole at the bottom. Then you would slowly pour water through the ashes. The water that dripped out the bottom was a caustic solution of potassium hydroxide, or lye. The old-timers had ways to test its strength. If a feather dissolved in it, or if it was strong enough to float an egg, it was ready. Then came the dangerous part. You would heat the fat in a large cauldron and slowly, carefully, pour in the lye. The mixture had to be stirred constantly for hours as it went through a chemical reaction called saponification. This is the process where the fatty acids react with the alkali to form soap and glycerin. It was hot, smelly, and hazardous work. Lye is highly caustic and can cause severe burns. When the mixture thickened to the right consistency, tracing as it's called, it was poured into shallow wooden boxes to cool and harden. After a day or two, it would be cut into rough bars. This green soap still had to cure for several weeks to allow the saponification process to complete and for the excess lye to be neutralized. The resulting soap was nothing like what we have today. It was a soft, brownish, jelly-like substance or a hard, rough bar. It wouldn't have had a pleasant scent unless herbs or flowers were added at the end of the process. But it worked. It could cut through grease and grime in a way that simple water never could. Guilds of soap makers or saponeri emerged in cities like Marseille, Genoa, and Venice, which became famous centers of soap production. The French in particular became known for their fine Castile-style soap, made with olive oil instead of animal fat, a trade learned from the soap makers of the Middle East during the Crusades. The first written record of a soapmakers guild is from Naples in the late 6th century. Making a simple lye soap today connects you to this raw alchemical tradition. It teaches you to be precise and to respect the materials you're working with. It's a reminder that cleanliness, which we see as a basic right, was once a hard-won craft. It also gives you a product that is uniquely your own, free from the synthetic detergents, foaming agents, and artificial fragrances found in most commercial soaps. But the history of hygiene is murky. While the Romans had public baths, their concept of cleaning often involved scraping the skin with a tool called a strigil after being oiled. The use of soap seems to have been inconsistent. After the fall of Rome, standards of public sanitation in Europe declined dramatically. The connection between filth and disease wasn't scientifically established until the 19th century with the work of people like Louis Pasteur and Joseph Lister. For centuries, soap was more about getting rid of visible dirt than fighting invisible germs. What regional variations of soap making have been lost to time, where there are specific plants or minerals used to create different types of lye with unique properties. How much did the common person in the medieval era actually use soap? Or was it reserved for washing clothes and linens rather than bodies? Could a deeper analysis of medieval soap recipes reveal a more sophisticated understanding of chemistry than we currently give our ancestors credit for? Number 11, can you heal with what grows in your garden? And long before there were pharmacies and pharmaceutical companies, there was the garden and the hedgerow. The practice of herbalism is as old as humanity itself. It is the original medicine. For a medieval person, the local herbalist, the monastery's infirmary, or simply the wise woman of the village was the primary source of healthcare. They possessed a deep practical knowledge of the plants that grew around them, which ones could soothe a cough, which could ease a fever, which could stop bleeding, and which could kill. This wasn't just folklore, though it was steeped in it. It was a system of knowledge passed down through generations and recorded in texts called herbals. One of the most remarkable figures in medieval herbalism was Hildegard of Bingen, a 12th century German abbess, writer, and mystic. In her work, Physica, she described the medicinal properties of hundreds of plants, trees, and animals. She wrote about using lavender to soothe headaches, yarrow to stop nosebleeds, and plantain to heal wounds. Her work was a combination of traditional German folk medicine, classical Greek and Roman texts, and her own direct observation. Learning the basics of herbalism today is an act of reclaiming this ancient knowledge. It begins with identification. You learn to recognize the plants in your own backyard not just as weeds, but as individual species with potential uses. Dandelion, often cursed by gardeners, was known as a powerful diuretic and liver tonic. Chickweed, another common weed, can be used in a poultice to soothe skin irritations. It's like learning a new language, one that allows you to read the landscape. The craft itself involves gathering, drying, and preparing the herbs. You might make a simple infusion, which is just a strong tea, or a decoction where you simmer tough roots or barks to extract their properties. A tincture involves soaking herbs in alcohol for several weeks to create a concentrated liquid extract. A salve or ointment is made by infusing herbs into oil and then thickening it with beeswax. Each preparation method is a skill in itself, designed to extract and preserve the plant's medicinal compounds in the most effective way. This practice forces a different kind of awareness. You have to pay attention to the seasons. You gather flowers when they are in full bloom, leaves before the plant flowers, and roots in the autumn after the plant's energy has returned to the ground. It fosters a deep connection to the cycles of nature. It's a stark contrast to our modern approach to medicine, where we are completely disconnected from the source of our remedies. We swallow a pill without any understanding of its origin or how it was made. Of course, this comes with a serious warning. Medieval herbalism was a mix of effective remedies, placebo, and dangerous poisons. Belladonna, also known as deadly nightshade, was used cosmetically to dilate pupils, but a small error in dosage could be fatal. The doctrine of signatures, a popular theory that a plant's appearance indicated its use. For example, the lung-shaped leaves of lungwort were used for respiratory ailments, was often more poetic than effective. Modern herbalism requires rigorous study and extreme caution, but the historical gaps in our knowledge are immense. The knowledge of wise women and village healers was almost entirely oral. When these people died, their unique understanding of the local ecosystem often died with them. The rise of university-trained male physicians and the persecution of folk healers during the witch trials of the late medieval and early modern periods undoubtedly destroyed a vast and irreplaceable library of plant-based medical knowledge. What specific herbal remedies used by medieval peasants were truly effective but have been completely forgotten by modern science? How did healers without written language transmit complex information about dosages and plant combinations? Were there regional schools of herbalism with distinct philosophies and practices that we can no longer identify? How many potent medicinal plants are still dismissed as common weeds, their secrets waiting to be rediscovered? Number 10. Can you make a book that lasts 1,000 years? In an age of disposable paperbacks and fleeting digital text, the idea of a medieval manuscript is almost alien. These were not just books, they were treasures. A single, large, illuminated Bible could take a team of craftsmen years to produce and be worth as much as a small farm. The skill of bookbinding and illumination was the art of making information permanent, beautiful, and monumental. It was the craft of creating a vessel worthy of holding the most important knowledge of their world. The process began not with paper, but with animal skin. Vellum and parchment were made from the processed skins of calves, sheep, or goats. The skins were soaked in lime, scraped clean of hair and flesh, and then stretched taut on a frame to dry. The result was a smooth, durable, and luminous writing surface. A large book like the 800-page Winchester Bible from the 12th century would have required the skins of around 250 calves. The pages, or folios, were cut to size and ruled with faint lines using a sharp point, creating a guide for the scribe. The scribe would then begin the slow, painstaking work of writing the text with a quill pen, cut from a goose or swan feather, and ink made from oak galls or carbon black. After the text was complete, the manuscript would go to the illuminator. This was the artist who would add the vibrant decorations, the gold leaf, and the miniature paintings in the margins and capital letters. They worked with pigments ground from minerals like lapis lazuli for blue, plants like weld for yellow, and insects like kermes for red. Applying gold leaf was a delicate process. A thin sheet of hammered gold was laid over a sticky base of gesso or glare egg white and then burnished until it shone like a mirror. The Book of Kells, an Irish gospel book from around 800 AD, is a breathtaking example of this art, with its wildly complex and imaginative illuminations. Finally, the finished and decorated pages would be sent to the bookbinder. The folios were folded and gathered into sections called quires. The quires were then sewn together onto strong linen cords or leather thongs stretched across a sewing frame. This created the solid block of the book. Wooden boards, often oak or beech, were attached to the cords to form the covers. The whole thing was then covered in leather, which could be decorated with blind tooling cap, impressing patterns into the damp leather, or with metal bosses and clasps. The result was a book that was also a fortress, built to protect the precious text within for centuries. Trying even a simplified version of this today is a profound lesson in materiality. You learn the feel of paper grain, the right way to fold a signature, the satisfying pull of a needle and thread through the pages. You're not just consuming information, you're creating the physical structure that contains it. It fosters a deep respect for the book as an object. When you have spent hours sewing a book block and casing it in, you'll never look at a book, even a cheap paperback, in the same way again. This craft was central to the preservation and transmission of knowledge in the West. For centuries, books were made almost exclusively in monasteries, where monks would copy religious texts as well as classical works of science and philosophy, preserving them through the so-called Dark Ages. The scriptorium of a monastery was its intellectual heart, but so much of the process remains a mystery. We analyze the pigments and the parchment, but the practical workshop knowledge is often lost. The specific recipes for inks and gessos were often closely guarded guild secrets. We can see the results, but we can't always perfectly replicate the process. How did illuminators achieve such vibrant, stable colors with their limited range of natural pigments, colors that have barely faded over 800 years? What were the unwritten tricks of the trade for stretching parchment to achieve the perfect paper-thin consistency? Were there forgeries or shortcuts used by less scrupulous workshops that are difficult for us to detect today? What did a medieval bookbinder's workshop actually smell and sound like? And what was the embodied, tactile knowledge that a master binder possessed in their hands, a knowledge that no manuscript can ever fully capture? Number 9, can you spin straw into gold, or at least thread? The old fairy tale of Rumpelstiltskin, where a girl must spin straw into gold, speaks to a fundamental truth of the pre-industrial world. The ability to spin fiber into thread was a kind of magic. It was the transformation of a raw, lumpy mass of fluff, be it wool from a sheep, flax from a plant, or even nettle fibers, into a strong, continuous strand. Without thread, there is no cloth, no clothes, no sails, no sacks, no bedding. Spinning was one of the most essential and time-consuming tasks of daily life, performed almost exclusively by women. The word distaff, the stick that holds the unspun fibers, became synonymous with women's work. The earliest method of spinning used a drop spindle. This is a simple tool, consisting of a stick with a weight, or whorl, at the bottom. The spinner draws out a few fibers from their supply, the distaff, gives the spindle a twist, and lets it drop. As it spins, it twists the fibers into thread. The spinner continuously feeds more fibers into the twisting strand, controlling the thickness and evenness with their fingers. Once a length of thread is spun, it's wound onto the spindle shaft, and the process begins again. It's a slow, rhythmic, and portable skill. A woman could spin while walking, while watching her children, or while sitting with her neighbors. Archaeological sites all over the world are littered with spindle whorls, made of clay, stone, or bone, some dating back to the Neolithic period. The spinning wheel was a major technological innovation arriving in Europe from the East around the 13th century. It dramatically increased the speed at which thread could be produced. The earliest wheels were simple, turned by hand. The flyer wheel, which came later, was an even greater improvement, allowing the spinner to both twist the thread and wind it onto a bobbin simultaneously, all powered by the rhythmic pumping of a foot treadle. But even with the wheel, spinning remained a significant bottleneck in textile production. It was estimated that it took as many as 10 spinners to produce enough thread to keep one weaver busy at their loom. Learning to spin, either with a spindle or wheel, is to learn a language of touch. Your fingers become your primary sense organs. You learn to feel the staple length of the wool, to sense when the twist is just right, to draft the fibers into a perfectly even stream. It is an incredibly grounding and meditative activity. The repetitive motion and the gentle whir of the wheel or spindle can be deeply calming. You are taking a chaotic substance and bringing it into a state of ordered, useful structure. This skill was at the very heart of the medieval economy. Wool was the backbone of England's wealth. The Lord Chancellor of England still sits on the woolsack in the House of Lords, a tradition started in the 14th century by King Edward III to symbolize the importance of the wool trade. The entire process, from shearing the sheep to selling the finished cloth, involved a whole chain of specialized crafts, but it all began with the humble spinner. Despite its ubiquity, the details of the spinner's craft are not well documented. Because it was domestic, female-led work, it was rarely written about by the male chroniclers of the time. The knowledge was passed from mother to daughter, not recorded in guild ledgers. What were the trade secrets of an expert medieval spinner to create exceptionally fine or strong thread? How did they prepare and blend different types of wool to achieve specific qualities in the final yarn? Were there regional spinning styles or techniques that have been completely lost? And how did the daily, constant, repetitive labor of spinning shape the physical bodies and the social lives of women for centuries in ways we can't fully appreciate? Number 8. Can you weave the fabric of society? If spinning is the act of creating the lines, weaving is the act of creating the plane. It is the craft of interlacing threads to create cloth. This is another foundational human technology, with evidence of woven textiles dating back tens of thousands of years. In the medieval period, the loom was a common piece of household furniture, and the weaver was a central figure in the community. They turned the endless thread produced by the spinners into the fabric that clothed everyone, from the king in his fine woolens to the peasant in her rough linen smock. The basic principle of weaving is simple. A set of lengthwise threads, called the warp, is held under tension on a loom. The weaver then passes a second thread, called the weft, over and under the warp threads. That's it, but this simple action is the basis for an infinite variety of patterns and textures. And by changing the sequence of which warp threads are lifted, the weaver can create everything from plain, functional cloth to complex decorative patterns like twills, herringbones, and damisks. The looms of the medieval period varied in complexity. The warp-weighted loom, an ancient design used by the Vikings and others, was a simple frame where the warp threads were kept taut by hanging weights of clay or stone at the bottom. The horizontal treadle loom, which was introduced to Europe around the 11th century, was a more complex machine. It allowed the weaver to use their feet to operate heddles, which lifted specific sets of warp threads, freeing up their hands to pass the shuttle carrying the weft thread back and forth. This innovation, like the spinning wheel, greatly increased the speed and complexity of the cloth that could be produced. Weaving is a craft of rhythm and pattern. It is both mathematical and physical. The weaver must set up the loom, a painstaking process called warping, where hundreds of threads must be arranged in the correct order and under the correct tension. Then the weaving itself begins, a rhythmic dance of feet on the treadles and hands throwing the shuttle. A loud, clacking sound filled the weaver's workshop, the sound of society's fabric being made. The profession was organized into powerful guilds like the Drapers' Company of London, which controlled the sale and quality of woolen cloth. Learning to weave on a simple frame, loom today is a window into this world. It teaches you about structure. You see, in the most direct way possible, how the simple crossing of threads creates a strong, flexible, and useful surface. It's an exercise in planning and execution. Any mistake made in setting up the warp will be magnified in the final cloth. It demands focus and a kind of mechanical empathy, an understanding of how tension and structure work together. The cloth produced by medieval weavers was not just a commodity, it was a carrier of identity and status. The color, quality, and pattern of a person's clothing immediately signaled their social standing. Sumptuary laws were passed that dictated who could wear what fabrics and colors. For example, 1363 English law restricted the wearing of silk and purple cloth to the royal family and the highest nobility. Cloth was wealth, and the ability to create it was power, but the intimate knowledge of the weaver is hard to access. We can study surviving textile fragments and analyze the weave structures, but the embodied knowledge is gone. The feel of the threads, the rhythm of the loom, the unwritten tricks for fixing a broken warp thread, and these were things learned through years of apprenticeship, not from a book. What were the secret patterns and weaving drafts known only to master weavers of the great cloth towns like Ghent and Florence? How did they use natural dyes, many of which are no longer in common use, to create their specific and sought-after colors? Could a weaver identify the work of another individual weaver just by the hand or feel of the cloth they produced? What complex looms or weaving techniques existed in some regions but never became widespread, leaving almost no trace in the historical record? Number 7, can you make a pot that sings on the fire? Before metal was common, and long after, the most important vessel in any household was the clay pot. Pottery is the craft of turning mud into stone. It is a process of elemental transformation using earth, water, and fire. A simple ceramic bowl is one of the most honest objects you can make. It holds your food, you can cook in it, and when it breaks, it returns to the earth. Or its fragments, its shards, last for millennia, telling archaeologists more about past daily lives than almost any other artifact. The process begins with the clay itself. In the medieval period, a potter wouldn't buy a neat block of clay from a supplier. They would dig it themselves from a local clay pit. They knew the properties of their local earth. They would then have to process it, a laborious task of drying, pounding, and slaking, soaking in water to remove impurities like rocks and roots. This was followed by wedging, or kneading the clay, to get a uniform consistency and remove air bubbles, which could cause the pot to explode in the kiln. Medieval potters in Europe generally didn't use the fast-spinning potter's wheel common in Asia and the Roman world. The technology was lost or fell out of use in many places. Instead, they often used a slow wheel or turntable or built their pots by coiling, pinching, or using slabs of clay. The forms were often rustic, sturdy, and deeply functional cooking pots with rounded bottoms to sit in the embers of a fire, big-bellied jugs for water or ale, and simple bowls for eating. The decoration was often simple, 2-incised lines, thumb-press patterns, or a simple lead glaze applied to the inside to make it waterproof. A 14th century English archaeological dig at a site like Lyvedon in Northamptonshire can unearth thousands of pottery shards, revealing the everyday cookware of a medieval village. The final stage is the firing. This is the moment of magic and terror for the potter. The dried, greenware, pots are carefully loaded into a kiln, which could be anything from a simple pit in the ground to a more complex wood-fired updraft kiln. The temperature is raised slowly over many hours to drive out the last of the water, and then taken up to over 1000 degrees Celsius. This is where the chemical change happens, turning the soft clay into hard, permanent ceramic. The potter had to be an expert in fire management, controlling the temperature and atmosphere in the kiln to get the right results. A mistake at this stage could ruin a week's worth of work. Making a simple pinch pot or a coil pot today strips away all the technology and connects you to the most basic act of creation. You take a lump of earth in your hands, and with only the pressure of your fingers, you form a vessel. It is an incredibly direct and satisfying process. It teaches you about the nature of the material, its plasticity, its memory, its limits. You learn to listen to the clay. Pottery was a vital local industry. A village potter supplied all the essential containers for their community. And while the pots were functional, they were not without beauty. The shape of a handle, the curve of a jug's belly, the simple green glaze, these things speak of a quiet, everyday aesthetic. The study of pottery, ceramics, petrology, allows archaeologists to analyze the mineral content of a clay shard and trace it back to its original geological source, sometimes revealing ancient trade routes and cultural connections. But our picture of the medieval potter is incomplete. They were often considered a lower status craft, dusty and humble. Their workshops, often on the outskirts of towns because of the fire risk from their kilns, have not always been well preserved. It was specific clay recipes and glaze formulas that potters guarded as family secrets. How did they achieve consistent firing temperatures in their simple kilns without any modern measuring devices, relying only on the color of the flame and the glow of the pots? Were there unique pottery forms or decorative styles that were specific to a single village or valley and are now lost? How much did the taste of food or drink depend on the specific type of local clay pot it was cooked or stored in, a kind of ceramic terroir we can no longer experience? Number 6. Can you raise a loaf from just flour, water, and air? Bread was not just a food in the medieval world, it was the food. The word lord comes from the Old English laugh word, meaning loaf ward or keeper of the bread. The word lady comes from leefdij, the loaf kneader. Bread was the foundation of the diet, the measure of sustenance. The price of bread was a matter of intense public concern, and laws like the assize of bread and ale, first enacted in 13th century England, regulated the size and price of a loaf to prevent riots. The ability to bake bread, therefore, was not a hobby, it was the fundamental skill of feeding a family. And this wasn't bread made with neat little packets of commercial yeast, this was sourdough. The leavening came from a starter or leaven, a living colony of wild yeast and bacteria captured from the air in the flour itself. This starter had to be kept alive, fed daily with fresh flour and water. It was a member of the family, often passed down through generations. A portion of the starter would be mixed with flour, water, and salt to make the dough. This dough would then ferment for many hours, sometimes overnight, as the wild yeast slowly produced carbon dioxide to raise the bread and the bacteria developed the complex, tangy flavors. The kneading was hard physical work, developing the gluten in the flour to give the bread its structure. Then the shaping of the loaf and the final proofing. The baking itself was another skill entirely. Most people did not have an oven in their homes. They would take their shaped loaves to a communal village oven or a local baker. The baker, or Baxter, was an expert in managing the huge wood-fired masonry oven. They knew how to get it to the right temperature, how to read the heat by tossing a handful of flour onto the oven floor, and how to time the baking of dozens of loaves at once. The bread they produced was hearty, dense, and deeply nutritious, with a thick, dark crust and a chewy, flavorful crumb. Baking a loaf of sourdough bread today is an act of rebellion against industrial food. You are opting out of the soft, bland, and characterless bread on the supermarket shelf. You are choosing to engage in a slow living process. Cultivating a starter feels like keeping a pet. It bubbles and grows, it has active days and sluggish days, you learn to read its signals. The process teaches patience. Sourdough cannot be rushed. It works on its own time, dictated by the temperature of your kitchen and the vigor of your starter. And the reward is a loaf of bread that is not just delicious, but also more digestible and nutritious than its commercial counterpart, a fact supported by modern studies on the effects of fermentation on grains. The variety of medieval breads was immense, and it was a direct reflection of the social hierarchy. The wealthy ate fine white bread called manchet, made from sifted wheat flour. And the common people ate muslin, a hearty, dark bread made from a mixture of wheat and rye, or even breads made from barley, oats, or peas during times of famine. The type of bread you ate told everyone your place in the world, but the sensory world of the medieval bakery is lost to us. We can analyze the chemical composition of bread residues found in archaeological sites, but we can't taste them. The specific strains of wild yeast and bacteria that populated their starters, unique to each village and each household, are gone forever. What was the true range of flavors in medieval sourdough shaped by local grains and unique microbial cultures? What were the unwritten baker's tricks for managing a massive wood-fired oven and 100 loaves of fermenting dough? How did the taste and texture of bread change with the seasons, based on the age of the flour and the ambient temperature? Did each family's starter truly have a unique, identifiable flavor that was recognized by the community, a kind of bread signature? Number 5, can you make the milk of a cow immortal? Milk is a wonderful food, but it is fleeting, it spoils quickly. In a world without refrigeration, this was a serious problem. How do you preserve the nutritional bounty of milk from the spring and summer for the lean months of winter? The answer was cheese. Cheese making is a form of controlled and guided rotting. It is the ancient craft of transforming perishable milk into a durable, portable, and nutrient-dense food. It is, in a very real sense, a way of making milk immortal. The basic process is ancient and elegant. First, you warm the milk. Then you add a starter culture of bacteria, which in medieval times would have come from a previous batch of cheese, or simply the ambient environment, and a coagulant. The most common coagulant is rennet, an enzyme complex found in the stomachs of young ruminant animals like calves or lambs. The rennet causes the milk protein, casein, to curdle and separate from the liquid whey. This curd is the beginning of the cheese. The curd is then cut into smaller pieces, stirred, and sometimes heated to expel more whey. The size to which the curd is cut helps determine the moisture content and thus the style of the final cheese. A fine-cut curd will produce a hard, dry, aged cheese like cheddar. A larger, rougher cut will result in a softer, moister cheese. After the whey is drained off, the curds are salted, pressed into molds to give them their shape, and then aged. The aging, or affinage, is where much of the magic happens. The cheese is left to mature for weeks, months, or even years in a cool, dark place. During this time, enzymes and microbes get to work, breaking down the fats and proteins and developing the complex flavors and textures that make cheese so compelling. Monasteries were the great centers of cheese-making innovation in the medieval period. Monks had the land for grazing animals, the resources to build dedicated cheese cellars, and the long-term, stable environment needed for experimentation. Many famous cheeses we know today have their roots in this monastic tradition. The Cistercian monks, for example, were renowned for their agricultural prowess and their cheese-making skills across Europe. The Domesday Book of 1086, a great survey of England, mentions cheese production in several locations, indicating its importance as both a food source and an economic product. Making a simple cheese at home, like a fresh farmer's cheese or a basic pressed cheese, is a revelation. It demystifies the process. You are actively participating in a controlled biological process. You are part chemist, part biologist, part chef. It connects you to your food in a way that buying a plastic wrapped block from the store never can. You learn that cheese is a living thing, constantly changing and developing. And like bread, cheese was a reflection of the land. The milk from cows grazing on the alpine pastures of Switzerland would produce a very different cheese from the milk of sheep grazing on the salty marshes of coastal England. The local water, the local plants, the local strains of bacteria, they all contributed to the unique character of the cheese. This is the concept of terroir, which we now associate with wine, but it applies just as strongly to cheese. Yet because cheesemaking was often a domestic or local craft, many of its secrets were never written down. The specific recipes and techniques were passed down through families and communities. The industrialization of food production in the 19th and 20th centuries wiped out countless local cheese varieties. What unique cheeses, with flavors we can no longer imagine, disappeared when small farmsteads were abandoned or consolidated. How did cheesemakers control the aging process in their rustic cellars to encourage desirable molds and bacteria while discouraging spoilage, all without a modern understanding of microbiology? Were there lost types of rennet derived from plants or other sources that were once in common use? How much of a master cheesemaker's skill was in their feel for the curd, an intuitive, non-verbal knowledge that can never be recovered from historical texts? Number 4, can you brew a drink safer than water? In the medieval world, water could kill you. Rivers and wells were often contaminated with human and animal waste, and waterborne diseases like cholera and dysentery were rampant. In this context, ale and beer were not primarily recreational drinks. They were a vital source of safe hydration and nutrition. The brewing process, which involves boiling the water, killed off dangerous pathogens. The resulting drink was not only safer than water, but also packed with calories and B vitamins. For a laboring peasant, a gallon of weak small beer a day was a fundamental part of their energy intake. Brewing was, for much of the medieval period, a domestic task, and the brewers were women, known as alewives or brewsters. Almost every household would have brewed its own ale for its own consumption. The process was simple but required skill. First, you make the wort. This involves malting grain, usually barley. The grain is soaked, allowed to sprout, and then dried in a kiln. This process develops the enzymes needed to convert the grain's starches into fermentable sugars. The malt is then milled or crushed and mixed with hot water in a process called mashing. This is where the enzymes do their work, creating a sweet, sugary liquid daki the wort. The wort is then drained off and boiled. This sterilizes it and allows for the addition of flavorings. Before the widespread use of hops in the later Middle Ages, brewers would use a mixture of herbs and spices called grut to flavor and preserve their ale. The ingredients of grut were often a closely guarded secret, and in many places, the local lord or monastery held a monopoly on its sale. After boiling, the wort is cooled and yeast is added. Again, this would not be a purified lab strain, but the yeast from a previous batch or simply wild yeast from the air. The yeast then consumes the sugars, producing alcohol and carbon dioxide. After a few days or weeks of fermentation, the ale is ready. The alewife was a fixture in every village. She would often sell her surplus ale to her neighbors, hanging a green branch or a symbolic allstake over her door to show that a fresh batch was ready. But it was a precarious business. Brewers were often accused of selling short measures or brewing weak ale, and they were a common target for satirists and moralists. The image of the quarrelsome, cheating alewife is a common trope in medieval literature, for example in the works of Geoffrey Chaucer. Learning to brew a simple, all-grain beer at home today is to participate in this long tradition. It is a wonderful mix of cooking, chemistry, and microbiology. You learn the importance of sanitation, the magic of fermentation, and the joy of creating a complex and satisfying drink from just 4 simple ingredients: water, malt, hops, and yeast. You are no longer a passive consumer, but an active creator. The shift from unhopped grut ale to hopped beer was a major change that occurred in the late Middle Ages. The hops, which had been used in brewing in Germany for centuries, began to spread across Europe. Hops had better preservative qualities than gruit and gave beer its characteristic bitter flavor. This change also helped shift brewing from a domestic craft to a larger scale, male-dominated commercial enterprise. The new beer could be stored longer and shipped further than the old ale. But our knowledge of this commonest of drinks is full of holes. The exact recipes for grut are almost all lost. We know some of the herbs they used: bog myrtle, yarrow, wild rosemary, but the specific combinations and proportions are a mystery. What did a typical medieval ale unhopped and brewed with wild yeast actually taste like? How did the flavor profile change from one village to the next based on the local water and the secret grut recipe of the local alewife? What was the real alcohol content of these ales, from the strong ale for festivals to the weak small beer for daily work? And what vast body of female brewing knowledge was lost when the craft moved from the home to the commercial brewery? Number 3, could you build a wall that will outlast you? We are surrounded by things that are designed to be temporary. Our phones, our furniture, our very houses seem built with a planned obsolescence. The medieval stonemason worked with the opposite philosophy. They built with eternity in mind. The cathedrals, castles, and stone walls they erected were designed to last for centuries, and many have. They are a testament to a craft that combined immense physical strength, a deep understanding of geometry, and an intimate knowledge of the properties of stone. The craft of the mason was divided into specializations. At the bottom was the rough mason or waller, who laid the rubble and flint for the core of the wall. Above them was the freemason, a more skilled artisan who worked with freestone, a fine-grained stone like limestone or sandstone that could be easily carved. These were the men who cut the precise blocks for the building's facing, the intricate traceries for the windows, and the statues that adorned the walls. They were itinerant, traveling from one great building project to the next, and they organized themselves into lodges, which were part workshop, part guild. and part social support network. The secrets and rituals of these lodges are the distant origin of modern Freemasonry. The work began in the quarry, where the master mason would select the right stone. They could read the stone, understanding its bedding planes and how it would weather over time. The quarried blocks were then transported to the building site, a monumental task in itself. On site, the Freemasons would use templates, often drawn out full size on a plaster tracing floor, to mark out the stones. And they would then shape them with a variety of tools, axes, adzes, and a whole range of chisels driven by a heavy wooden mallet. The motto of the mason was to cut to the line. Precision was everything. An ill-fitting block could compromise the integrity of an entire wall or arch. The mortar they used was also a craft in itself. It was a simple lime mortar, made by burning limestone or chalk in a kiln to create quicklime, which was then slaked with water. This mortar set not by drying, but through a slow chemical reaction with carbon dioxide in the air, a process called carbonation. It was a soft mortar, more flexible than modern Portland cement, which allowed the massive stone buildings to shift and settle slightly over time without cracking. The Masons of Wells Cathedral in England, after an earthquake in the 1240s, built incredible scissor arches to brace the central tower, a brilliant and beautiful piece of structural engineering that still stands today. Learning the basics of dry stone walling, a related craft that uses no mortar, is a powerful lesson in physics and patience. You learn that every stone has a face and a place. You learn to build for strength, laying the stones in a way that they lock together, using gravity as your ally. You are solving a complex three-dimensional puzzle. The wall grows slowly, stone by stone. It's a dialogue between you and the material. The great cathedrals are perhaps the ultimate expression of the stonemason's art. These were projects that took generations to complete. The man who laid the foundation would never see the spire completed. It required a kind of long-term vision and communal effort that is hard to imagine today. The master mason was the architect, engineer, and project manager, all in one. Men like Villard de Honnecourt, a 13th century French master mason, left behind sketchbooks that give us a glimpse into their minds, filled with drawings of architectural details, clever lifting devices, and geometric schemes. But the knowledge of these master builders was profoundly practical and often unwritten. They learned through a long apprenticeship. We can measure their buildings, we can analyze the tool marks on the stone, but we cannot get inside their heads. What were the geometric secrets and rules of thumb that allowed master masons to lay out and construct such complex structures as vaulted ceilings and flying buttresses? How did they lift massive stones hundreds of feet in the air using only timber cranes and human or animal power? And how many catastrophic failures did they have? Were there specific unwritten techniques for reading the structural stresses in a building as it was being constructed? And what was the full meaning of the cryptic mason's marks, the personal symbols that masons carved on the stones they cut? Were they just a way to get paid, or did they have a deeper symbolic significance within the lodge? Number 2, can you see the soul of a piece of wood? Well, wood was the most versatile and essential material of the medieval world. It was the frame of your house, the chair you sat on, the bowl you ate from, the cart that carried your goods, and the handle of your every tool. The woodworker, whether a carpenter, a joiner, or a carver, was the craftsman who gave this material its form and function. They possessed a deep, intuitive understanding of the nature of wood, its grain, its strength, its tendency to warp and split. The craft began in the forest. A woodworker would learn to look at a living tree and see the finished object within it. They knew which tree would provide a long, straight beam for a house frame. They knew that a naturally curved branch could be turned into a strong, load-bearing brace without having to cut across the grain, a technique known as grown timber. They understood how to fell a tree, how to season the wood slowly to prevent cracking, and how to split or saw it into usable planks. The introduction of water-powered sawmills in the 13th century began to change this process, but for much of the period, converting a log into a board was a laborious process done with axes, adzes, and large two-man pit saws. The carpenter was the builder. They constructed the timber frames of houses, barns, and ships. A key skill was joinery. In a world where metal nails were expensive and often handmade, carpenters developed a sophisticated vocabulary of interlocking wooden joints to hold their structures together. The mortise and tenon joint, the dovetail joint, the lap joint, these were the techniques that held their world together. A well-made timber-framed building, like the ones that still stand in cities like York or Chester, was a complex puzzle of precisely cut joints, held together with wooden pegs or trunnels. These frames were designed to be strong yet flexible. The joiner and the carver worked on a finer scale. They made furniture, chests, and decorative carvings for churches and wealthy homes. They worked with hand tools, saws, planes, chisels, gouges, and augers. The marks of these tools are still visible on medieval woodwork, a direct record of the craftsman's hand. The intricate choir stalls or the beautifully carved roof bosses found in many English churches are a testament to their incredible skill. The misericords, the small carved shelves on the underside of choir stall seats, were a particular specialty, often decorated with lively and sometimes comical scenes from everyday life or folklore. Learning to work wood with hand tools is a journey into sensory awareness. You learn the smell of fresh-cut oak. You learn the sound of a sharp plane shaving off a whisper-thin curl of wood. You learn the feel of the grain under your hand and how to work with it, not against it. It is a slow, quiet, and deeply satisfying process. Making a simple, functional object like a small stool or a box using only hand tools connects you to this ancient craft in a very direct way. It teaches you to appreciate the beauty and character of a material we now so often cover with paint or laminate. The woodworker's knowledge was vast and specific. They knew that oak was strong and durable, perfect for framing. They knew that ash was tough and flexible, ideal for tool handles and longbows. They knew that linden wood was soft and even-grained, perfect for carving. This was a knowledge born of a lifetime of experience. The Borgenstave Church in Norway, built around 1200 AD, is an incredible masterpiece of woodworking, a complex structure of posts, planks, and intricate carvings that has survived for over 800 years. But this deep, tactile knowledge is the hardest kind to preserve. We have the objects they made, but not the minds that made them. The logic of the hand and the eye is not easily translated into words. What were the unwritten rules of thumb that a master carpenter used to design a timber frame that would settle perfectly and last for centuries? How did woodcarvers achieve such fine, delicate detail with their relatively simple set of hand tools? Were there types of wood finishes or preservatives made from plants or other natural substances that we have now completely forgotten? And how much of their understanding of wood was almost mystical, a kind of dialogue with the spirit of the tree itself, a perspective that is completely alien to our modern, mechanistic view of materials? Number 1, can you shape your world with fire and steel? Of all the medieval crafts, none is more elemental, more transformative than that of the blacksmith. The smith was a kind of magician. They took a lump of dull, lifeless rock iron ore, and through the alchemy of fire, they turned it into the material that built their world. They made the nails that held the houses together, the hinges for the doors, the plowshares that broke the soil, the axes that felled the trees, the knives for the kitchen, and the swords for the soldier. The blacksmith's forge was the hot, beating heart of the medieval village. The rhythmic clang of the hammer on the anvil was the soundtrack of its daily life. The process began with a bloomery, a simple furnace where iron ore was heated with charcoal. This did not melt the iron, but created a spongy mass of iron and slag called a bloom. The smith would then take this bloom to the forge, a hearth filled with burning charcoal made intensely hot by a bellows. Reheating the bloom and hammering it repeatedly would consolidate the iron and drive out the impurities. This was back-breaking, brutally hot work. The result was wrought iron, a relatively soft but tough and workable material. The true art of the smith was in manipulating this iron. There were a few fundamental techniques. Drawing out meant hammering the iron to make it longer and thinner. Upsetting was the opposite, making it shorter and thicker. Bending, punching holes, and forge welding, the process of heating 2 pieces of iron to a scintillating white heat and hammering them together until they fuse into a single piece were the other key skills. The smith had to be able to read the color of the hot metal. A cherry red was good for bending, a bright orange for drawing out, and a near white heat was needed for welding. This was a language of color and heat learned over a long apprenticeship. The smith was also a metallurgist. They knew how to make steel, which is iron with a small amount of carbon added. By repeatedly heating iron in the carbon-rich environment of the charcoal forge and folding it over on itself, they could introduce carbon into the metal, making it much harder. They then had to master the arts of hardening and tempering. A steel tool, like a chisel or an axe head, would be heated to a critical temperature and then quenched in water or oil. This would make it incredibly hard, but also brittle. The smith would then temper it by carefully reheating it to a lower temperature, judging the exact heat by the iridescent colors that would form on the polished surface of the steel girth to restore some of its toughness. This was a delicate and precise process. A few seconds too long in the fire, and the temper would be ruined. The Viking era, Ulfbert's swords, known for their high-quality steel, show a level of metallurgical skill that was not common again for centuries. Learning the basics of blacksmithing today is a primal experience. You are working with the four classical elements: earth the iron, air from the bellows, fire the forge, and water the quenching tub. The force of the hammer blow, the roar of the fire, the hiss of the hot steel in the water, it is a full-body sensory experience. It teaches you about the fundamental nature of metal. You learn that it is not a dead, inert substance, but a material with a life and will of its own. You have to work with it to persuade it, not just force it. The blacksmith was a vital and respected member of the community. They were the creators of tools, and tools are what separate us from the animals. They enabled all the other crafts. The woodworker needed the smith's axe and chisel. The farmer needed the smith's plow and scythe. The mason needed the smith's hammer and point. The smith was the master of the hard edge, the one who made civilization's work possible. Finds like the Mastemyr chest, a Viking Age tool chest discovered in Sweden, give us a beautiful snapshot of a smith's toolkit with over 200 well-preserved iron tools. But the secrets of the master smiths are the most elusive of all. Their knowledge was physical, embodied in their muscles and their eyes. They worked by feel, by sound, by sight. They were the original material scientists, but their labs were their forges and their notebooks were their memories. How did the great armorers of Milan or Augsburg create steel plate that was both hard enough to stop a sword blow and flexible enough not to shatter? What were the secret flux recipes used to create a perfect forge weld? Did different schools of blacksmithing have distinct, untranslatable languages of hammer blows with specific rhythms and strikes for different tasks? And what was the true intuitive, almost psychic connection that a master smith, after 50 years at the anvil, had with their fire and their steel, a connection that no amount of modern science can ever hope to replicate?